Rebecca woke up each morning with a deep, nagging sense of exhaustion, not from her responsibilities as a mother or a professional, but from the emotional weight of a marriage that had slowly withered. She was 42 years old, and after almost 20 years of marriage to David, the man she had once adored, the spark had long faded. The once vibrant love they shared now felt like a distant memory, replaced by the mundane rhythm of everyday life. David had always been a steady, reliable presence in her life, but over the years, he had become more of a housemate than a husband. Their conversations revolved around schedules, bills, and household chores. The affection they used to express in small, tender gestures had been replaced by silence or brief exchanges about the practicalities of daily life. Rebecca couldn't remember the last time they had truly connected, laughed together, shared something intimate, or even held hands without thinking about it. It was the same every day: wake up, get the kids ready for school, go to work, come home, make dinner, go to bed. The cycle seemed endless, and each day felt like she was moving through it on autopilot. The passion and excitement that once filled their relationship seemed like a distant dream, a version of their life that no longer existed. Her mind often wandered to the past, to the days when she and David had spent hours talking about their hopes and dreams, when they couldn't get enough of each other's company. But now, those conversations felt like relics of a bygone era. Rebecca couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had all changed, but she could feel the void growing larger with each passing day. One morning, as she sat at the kitchen table sipping her coffee, she glanced at her phone and came across an article titled, "The Marriage Reset: How Therapy Can Bring Back the Love." Intrigued, she clicked on the link. The article discussed couples who had found themselves in the same emotional rut, feeling disconnected and unsure of how to fix it. It described how therapy had helped many couples rediscover their love, their passion, and their emotional connection. For the first time in a long while, Rebecca felt a glimmer of hope. She hadn't realized just how much she missed the idea of truly connecting with David. It wasn't about fixing something that was broken, it was about rebuilding what they had lost, finding their way back to each other, and reigniting the love they once shared. The idea of therapy wasn't foreign to her, but she had always thought of it as a last resort, something couples did when everything else had failed. But as she read the article, Rebecca realized that maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe it wasn't about fixing a broken marriage, it was about learning to communicate, to share, to love again. That night, after dinner, Rebecca brought up the idea of marriage therapy with David. She hesitated at first, unsure of how he would react. They had never really discussed the state of their relationship in any depth, and she wasn't sure if he even felt the same way she did. She knew he loved her, but was it the same kind of love they had when they first got married? Could they rediscover that? David looked at her with a mix of surprise and curiosity as she explained the article she had read and the therapy course she wanted to try. He listened quietly, nodding occasionally, but Rebecca could tell he wasn't fully convinced. He had always been more reserved, less expressive, and he didn't share her urgency about making changes. Still, after some back and forth, he agreed to give it a try, although he wasn't entirely sure it would help. As Rebecca climbed into bed that night, she felt a sense of relief. Even if David wasn't completely on board, she had taken the first step. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and she didn't expect miracles overnight. But she finally felt like she had a chance to rediscover her marriage, to rediscover herself, and perhaps most importantly, to rediscover love. In the quiet of the night, Rebecca allowed herself to hope. Maybe this would be the reset they needed to start over, to rebuild the connection they had lost along the way. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of excitement. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. Rebecca woke up the next morning feeling a mix of nervous excitement. She had never been one to take drastic steps, especially when it came to something as delicate as her marriage. But after the conversation with David last night, she felt more determined than ever to make a change. Therapy wasn't something she had ever thought about before, but something about the idea of rediscovering their connection sparked a new sense of hope in her. Over breakfast, as David sipped his coffee in silence, Rebecca found herself wondering if he truly understood how important this was to her. They had been living in this comfortable but emotionally stagnant place for so long, that it almost felt normal to not talk about their feelings. She knew David didn't feel the same sense of urgency, but she also knew he wasn't unhappy, just indifferent. And that was the problem. Indifference was slowly suffocating their marriage. She cleared her throat and looked up at him. "David, I've been thinking a lot about last night. I know you're not sure about this therapy thing, but I really believe it could help us. I can't keep going like this, feeling so disconnected. It's like we're living parallel lives instead of being a team. David set down his coffee and looked at her with a furrowed brow. I don't know, Rebecca. It's not that I don't care, I just don't see what a few sessions are going to change. We've been together a long time, and we've gotten through tougher stuff, right? Rebecca sighed, trying to gather her thoughts. I know, but this is different. We're not fighting, we're not angry, we're just not connecting anymore. And that's what worries me. I miss us, David. I miss the way we used to be. David stared into his coffee cup, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge. Rebecca could tell he was processing what she said, but it was hard to tell whether he truly understood her. After a few moments of silence, he nodded slowly. All right, if it means that much to you, I'll go with you. We can give it a shot. But I don't know what we're going to get out of it. Rebecca smiled, relieved but still apprehensive. She didn't expect him to be overjoyed about the idea, but at least he was willing to try. She knew it was a step forward, even if it was just a small one. Later that day, she called the therapy center she had found online and scheduled their first session. It felt surreal. A few weeks ago, she would have never imagined taking this step, but now, she felt a sense of empowerment. She was actively doing something to fix what was broken, even if it felt uncomfortable. As she hung up the phone, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. That night, as she sat down to dinner with David and the kids, she couldn't help but notice how quiet the house felt. The kids were talking about their school projects, and David was checking his phone, absent-mindedly scrolling through messages. Rebecca realized how much she missed hearing David's voice, not just about the trivial details of their day, but about how he was feeling, about life. She longed for those deep, meaningful conversations they used to have. After dinner, she went to the kitchen to clear the table while David sat on the couch flipping through a TV channel. For a moment, she just watched him, wondering if he could feel what she was feeling. She wanted to tell him how much she needed more than this. More than the quiet evenings, more than the routine, more than just being roommates. But instead, she simply sighed and finished cleaning up. The next day, Rebecca showed up to their first therapy session with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The office was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the sterile, uncomfortable spaces she had imagined. A kind-looking therapist named Dr. Laura, who had been recommended to her by a friend, welcomed them both into her office. David looked uneasy as they sat down, his legs crossed and his arms folded, his usual posture when he was uncomfortable. Rebecca could feel the tension in the room, but she knew it was normal. The unknown always made people anxious, especially when it involved something as personal as their marriage. Dr. Laura began by asking them to share a little about their relationship. Rebecca went first, explaining the history of their marriage, the highs and the lows, how they had fallen into a comfortable routine, and how recently, she felt like they had grown apart. David, though initially quiet, eventually spoke up. He acknowledged that he felt like they were stuck in a rut, but he didn't know how to get out of it. He admitted that he wasn't sure what therapy could do to fix things, but he was willing to give it a try. Rebecca could feel the weight lifting off her shoulders as he spoke. It wasn't that he had suddenly transformed into an emotional conversationalist, but the fact that he was opening up, even a little, felt like progress. Dr. Laura listened carefully, nodding and making notes as they spoke. She then suggested they focus on learning how to communicate more openly and honestly with each other. She explained that many couples, especially those who had been together for as long as Rebecca and David, often drifted into patterns of non-communication, assuming their partner knew what they needed or how they felt. The first step is to relearn how to listen and express yourselves, Dr. Laura said, her voice calm and reassuring. You've been living side by side for so long, but now it's time to really see each other again. To ask the right questions and be willing to answer them honestly. Rebecca looked at David, her heart pounding in her chest. She wondered if he was thinking what she was thinking, that this could be their chance to rebuild their connection, to rediscover the intimacy and closeness that had slowly faded away. She wasn't sure where this journey would take them, but she was ready to find out. As they left the session that evening, Rebecca felt a quiet sense of hope. It wasn't a grand revelation, but it was a start, a tiny but important first step toward healing. The road ahead would be long, and there would be moments of doubt and discomfort, but Rebecca had made her decision. She was determined to fight for her marriage, to reset it in a way that felt true to both her and David. The weeks after their first therapy session felt like a mix of hope and uncertainty. Rebecca and David both entered the process with different expectations. Rebecca was eager to embrace the challenge, convinced that they could rekindle the love they once shared. David, on the other hand, was more skeptical, unsure of how much could really change after so many years of routine. Still, he had agreed to try, and that was a start. Their second session was scheduled for a Friday evening, which felt like a long wait as the days dragged on. Rebecca found herself thinking about it constantly: how to express herself, how to listen better, how to make sure David felt heard. She practiced small things, like asking more questions about his day, and started consciously slowing down their conversations, really paying attention to what he was saying. But it wasn't always easy. One afternoon, they had a small disagreement about the weekend schedule. David was planning to spend a few hours fixing the car, but Rebecca had wanted him to help with the garden, where weeds had taken over the flower beds. She could feel the old frustration creeping in as she asked, "Why can't you just take care of this with me? We never spend time together anymore." David, a little taken aback by the tension in her voice, sighed and snapped, "I'm not trying to avoid you, Rebecca. But I've been meaning to fix the car for weeks." The words came out sharper than either of them expected. Rebecca's heart sank, and for a moment, she felt herself withdrawing. But then something in her, something that had been buried under years of frustration, pushed her to do something different. Instead of retreating into silence, she took a deep breath and said, "I'm sorry. It's hard for me to ask for your help sometimes. I feel like we're drifting further apart, and I don't know how to fix it." She immediately regretted the vulnerability, but there was no taking it back. She looked up, expecting him to respond with the same indifference that had been so common recently. To her surprise, David softened. "I didn't know you felt that way," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I don't want us to drift apart either." Rebecca felt a warmth spread through her chest, a flicker of hope. She had spoken her truth without shutting down, and for the first time in a long time, David had listened, not just heard her words but felt them. That evening, they made a deal. David would spend a few hours fixing the car while Rebecca worked on the garden. When they were done, they'd meet in the kitchen and share a bottle of wine. The plan was simple, but it felt like a small victory, another step toward reconnecting, even if it wasn't perfect. When Friday finally arrived, Rebecca was filled with a nervous anticipation. As they sat together in Dr. Lara's office, she noticed a slight shift in both of them. They had been practicing the techniques Dr. Lara had suggested, listening more actively, asking open-ended questions, expressing their feelings without blame. And although the results weren't immediate, there was something undeniably different in the air. Dr. Lara asked them how they had been doing with the exercises, and Rebecca shared the story of the garden and car argument. "It wasn't perfect," she said, "but we actually talked about it instead of shutting down or getting defensive." David added, "I didn't realize how much we had been avoiding these little things. I don't want to be the person who just shuts down every time something's off." Dr. Lara smiled. "That's a huge breakthrough," she said. "You both made the choice to stop the cycle of avoidance and instead face the discomfort. That's a big step forward." Rebecca felt a sense of pride in their progress, but at the same time, there was an underlying fear that all of this would slip away, that they would fall back into their old patterns. What if it was just temporary? What if, in the end, they couldn't really get back what they had lost? Dr. Lara could sense Rebecca's hesitation and addressed it gently. "It's normal to have doubts, especially when change feels hard. But remember, change doesn't always happen overnight. The most important thing is that you're both here, you're both committed, and you're learning to communicate in new ways. That's the foundation of a stronger relationship." David nodded, though his face was still a little guarded. He wasn't the type to be openly emotional, but Rebecca could see that the therapy was starting to affect him. She was starting to see cracks in the armor he'd built around himself for so many years. As the weeks passed, Rebecca continued to notice small changes in David. He began to ask her how she was feeling more often, something he hadn't done in years. He also started sharing more about his own emotions, his stress at work, his worries about their future, his love for their children. It was as though a door had been opened inside of him, one that had been closed for a long time. One evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, David turned to Rebecca with a look of sincerity in his eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began, "about how we've been living parallel lives. I don't want that. I don't want to lose you." Rebecca felt her throat tighten. She had been waiting for a moment like this for so long, but hearing it come from David's lips made it feel all the more real. "I don't want that either," she whispered, feeling the weight of the words settle between them. They sat in silence for a while, letting the evening air cool around them. For the first time in ages, it felt like they were truly together, not just occupying the same space but sharing it, feeling it. Rebecca knew they still had a long way to go, and she was well aware that therapy wouldn't fix everything. But what she felt in that moment was something she hadn't felt in years: hope. They weren't there yet, but they were on the path. And that was enough for now. In the days that followed, Rebecca made it a point to keep pushing forward, despite the small doubts that still lingered in the back of her mind. Therapy wasn't magic. It wouldn't erase all the pain, all the years of neglect. But it was a tool, a lifeline, a way to carve a new path for herself and David. Rebecca wasn't sure where this journey would take them, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were moving in the right direction. And that, she realized, was the most important thing. The weeks following their breakthrough felt like a fragile, tentative peace had settled between Rebecca and David. There were still moments of tension, moments where the old patterns threatened to creep back in. But for the first time in years, Rebecca didn't feel like she was fighting alone. She felt like they were both in this together, even if they were taking small steps toward repairing the damage that had built up over time. It was a Wednesday evening when Rebecca noticed the change in David. He had been quieter than usual, his brow furrowed as he sifted through papers on the kitchen table. It was one of those small, fleeting moments, but Rebecca knew something was off. He wasn't the type to get anxious or moody easily, and yet tonight, he seemed lost in thought. She couldn't let it go. "David," she started softly, walking over to where he sat, "you okay?" He glanced up at her, his expression momentarily distant. "Yeah. Just work stuff. You know how it is." Rebecca studied him for a moment, the familiar signs of emotional distance creeping back into his eyes. His answer was vague, as it always was when he didn't want to talk about something. Normally, she would have let it slide, given him space, and avoided pushing him. But not tonight. Not after everything they had worked on in therapy. She took a deep breath. "You've been like this for a few days. Is it really just work, or is there something else going on? You know you can talk to me." David looked at her for a long moment, as if considering whether he should say anything. Then, with a deep sigh, he pushed the papers aside and leaned back in his chair. "It's not just work. I've been thinking a lot about us, actually. About where we're going." Rebecca felt a tightness in her chest, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she sat down across from him and waited for him to continue. "Everything feels different, and I don't know if I'm ready for it," David admitted, rubbing his hands over his face. "I know we've been trying to fix things, but it feels like we're walking on eggshells sometimes. I don't know if I'm doing enough, or if I even know how to make everything right." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to voice his uncertainty like this. She had always thought of him as the steady one, the one who never seemed to question his place in their relationship. This rawness was new, and she wasn't sure how to react. But instead of retreating, she reached across the table, placing her hand gently on his. "I don't have all the answers either, David. But I know that we're in this together. I want to keep trying, and I want you to try too. I'm scared too, you know. I'm scared that we'll fall back into the same old routine. But I'm willing to fight for us. I just need you to be here with me." David looked down at her hand, his eyes softening. He hadn't been prepared for the intensity of her words, nor for the vulnerability she was showing him. After a long pause, he nodded slowly. "I want that too, Rebecca. I want to make this work." Rebecca squeezed his hand, a mixture of relief and trepidation flooding her chest. They were both being honest, and that was a step forward. But there was still so much to work through, and they both knew it. There were no quick fixes, no easy solutions. The road ahead would be full of difficult conversations and uncomfortable emotions. The next therapy session came sooner than expected. It had been a week since their conversation, and Rebecca felt a mixture of excitement and dread. She wanted to believe that things were moving in the right direction, but she knew that growth didn't always feel good. Sometimes it was painful. Sometimes, it brought up things that had been buried for years. As they sat down with Dr. Laura, Rebecca noticed that David seemed unusually quiet. She wasn't sure if it was because he was nervous or if he was processing everything they had been talking about in their own time. But his eyes were less guarded than usual, and for once, he wasn't fidgeting or checking his phone. Dr. Laura began by asking them about their progress and how they had been feeling over the past week. Rebecca hesitated for a moment before speaking, unsure of where to start. But she decided to be honest. "We've made some progress," she said, glancing at David for reassurance. "But it's been hard. I think we're both scared that we won't be able to change, or that we'll lose the connection we're trying so hard to rebuild." David nodded, looking at the floor for a moment before meeting Dr. Lara's gaze. "I guess I've been feeling overwhelmed. It feels like we're doing a lot of work to fix things, but I'm not sure if I'm doing it right. I don't know if I'm giving enough, or if I'm just getting in the way." Rebecca felt a pang of sympathy for him. She could hear the self-doubt in his voice, and it made her realize just how much he had been carrying. She reached over and placed her hand on his, a silent gesture of support. Dr. Lara noticed the moment of connection between them and smiled. "It's good that you're both opening up about your fears. That's a major part of healing, acknowledging the doubt and uncertainty, and not allowing it to control the relationship." She turned to David. "David, part of what's challenging about change is the fear of failure. You're afraid that you might not be able to fix things perfectly. But that's not what this process is about. It's about showing up, being present, and committing to the effort, even when it's messy." Rebecca felt a weight lift off her shoulders as Dr. Lara spoke. She had been so focused on fixing everything, so worried about whether they would get back to where they used to be. But the truth was, they weren't trying to go back. They were trying to move forward, together. Later that evening, as they sat in the quiet of their living room, Rebecca realized something important. They had faced the hard conversations, the ones they had avoided for so long, and they were still standing. They weren't perfect. They had both made mistakes. But they were trying. And that was enough. David looked over at her, his voice soft but genuine. "I think I'm starting to understand what you meant before. About not being afraid to say what we need, even when it's difficult. I don't always know how to do it, but I'm willing to learn." Rebecca smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "We'll learn together," she said, her voice thick with feeling. "One step at a time." As they sat together, side by side, Rebecca knew that there was still a long way to go. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the future. They were building something real, something stronger than what they had before. And that was worth fighting for. The weeks that followed their breakthrough conversation felt like an ongoing balancing act. Rebecca had long ago realized that fixing a relationship wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic shifts, it was about the small moments. It was in the quiet conversations, the shared looks, the unspoken understanding. And in those small moments, she could feel the shift. But it was slow, and it wasn't without its challenges. David was still struggling with how much to give, how much to open up. He had always been a man of few words, and even after all the therapy sessions, some things remained locked inside him. Rebecca, on the other hand, was learning to be more patient, more willing to accept the quiet spaces between their conversations. One Saturday morning, Rebecca woke up early, as she often did. The house was still quiet, and the sunlight streamed through the kitchen window. As she prepared coffee, she found herself reflecting on the changes that had come in the past few months. They were subtle but meaningful. The tension that once hung over their mornings was gone. The silent awkwardness when David left for work was replaced with quiet, easy exchanges. He would kiss her goodbye and linger for a moment longer than usual, as though savoring the simple act of connection. But there were still those moments of doubt, the times when Rebecca wondered if this new version of their relationship was truly sustainable. She had always been the type to worry, to imagine all the ways things could go wrong. What if this was just temporary? What if they were simply going through the motions, only to fall back into old patterns once the excitement of change wore off? She was shaken from her thoughts when she heard the door open, and David stepped into the kitchen. He looked tired, but there was a softness to his eyes that she hadn't noticed in a long time. "Morning," he said, his voice hoarse from sleep. "Good morning," Rebecca replied, smiling as she handed him a cup of coffee. "How's the day looking?" David sighed, accepting the coffee. "Busy, but manageable. I'm glad it's Saturday though. I needed this break." Rebecca looked at him, feeling a surge of affection. There was something different about the way he spoke to her now, more present, more aware of her. It wasn't that the tension had disappeared entirely, but it was as if they were beginning to understand each other again in a way they hadn't for years. They sat together in the kitchen, sipping coffee and talking about the mundane things that made up their daily lives, plans for the weekend, updates on the kids, little household repairs. The kind of things that used to feel like an obligation, but now, they seemed like a shared rhythm, a comfortable familiarity. It was in these small moments that Rebecca began to realize something important. They didn't need grand declarations of love to feel connected. They needed the quiet presence, the understanding of each other's needs, and the willingness to show up for one another, even on the days when they didn't have much energy left to give. Later that afternoon, they worked together in the garden, as they had agreed to do weeks earlier. Rebecca had started the project by herself, but today, David offered to help. He was outside more often now, not just to fix things or handle the practical aspects of the home, but because he wanted to spend time with her. That, in itself, was a revelation. As they worked side by side, Rebecca found herself noticing the little things: David's concentration as he carefully pruned the rose bushes, the way he asked her opinion on where to plant the new flowers, and how his hand brushed against hers occasionally as they moved around the garden. These touches, these small gestures, spoke volumes more than any grand romantic words ever could. At one point, David paused, wiping his brow, and turned to her. "I know it's been a while since we did things like this. Just spent time together without distractions. It feels nice." Rebecca smiled, her heart swelling. "It does. I didn't realize how much I missed just being with you." They shared a look, and in that moment, Rebecca knew that they had made it past the hardest part, the uncertainty. The fear of whether they could truly reconnect had started to fade, replaced by a growing confidence in their ability to rebuild. There was still work to be done, still a lot of ground to cover, but for the first time in a long time, Rebecca felt a quiet optimism about their future. That evening, after dinner, they sat on the couch, each of them in their own world for a few moments. David was watching TV, and Rebecca was reading a book. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was peaceful. For once, Rebecca didn't feel the urge to fill the space with words or worry about what David was thinking. She just sat with him, enjoying his presence. After a while, David turned to her, his voice soft. "I've been thinking about the future," he said, almost as if the thought had just occurred to him. "About where we're going, and what we want." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. They had talked about the present, about the small changes they were making, but they hadn't yet talked about the future, about the years ahead, the path they were paving for themselves. "What do you mean?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. David shifted in his seat, his eyes thoughtful. "I think I'm starting to see what you meant when you said we were living parallel lives. I don't want that anymore. I want to be more present, not just with the kids, not just in the house, but with you. I want to keep doing this, keep making things better, keep working on us." Rebecca felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected such an honest declaration. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was everything she needed to hear. It was his way of saying without any fanfare that he was committed, not just to the process of therapy or to their relationship, but to her. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I want that too. I don't want to just exist alongside you. I want to grow with you. I want us to keep building something together." For the first time in months, Rebecca allowed herself to feel hopeful about the future. They weren't where they used to be, and they weren't where they wanted to be yet, but they were on their way. They were in this together, step by step, and that was all that mattered. The next few weeks were filled with more of these quiet, meaningful moments. Their conversations, though still simple, began to take on more depth. They shared more of their thoughts, their worries, their dreams, and for the first time in a long time, Rebecca felt seen, truly seen by David. Not just in the way he looked at her, but in the way he listened, the way he responded, and the way he showed up for her in the small, everyday moments. They still had a long road ahead, but Rebecca realized something profound: the small moments mattered. It wasn't always about big changes or dramatic shifts, it was in the day-to-day actions, the gestures of kindness, the effort to understand each other, and the quiet commitment to make things work. And for the first time in a long time, Rebecca felt a quiet peace settle within her. Maybe they weren't perfect, but they were real. And that, she thought, was enough. The days had begun to blur together as Rebecca and David continued their journey through therapy. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were both truly trying to reconnect. The emotional walls that had once kept them apart were slowly crumbling, and while they still had moments of doubt, the foundation they were building was stronger than before. One afternoon, as Rebecca sat on the porch, reading a book, she found herself lost in thought. She watched the wind gently rustle the trees in their backyard, the sun casting a warm glow over everything. Life, for the first time in a long while, felt peaceful. She could hear David inside, finishing up a work call, his voice muffled by the closed window. But it wasn't just the quiet of the house that made her feel at ease, it was the comfort of knowing that David was there. Really there. It wasn't always the grand sweeping gestures of love that made her heart skip a beat anymore. It was in these smaller moments, the way David's smile made her feel like the most important person in the room, the way he now took the time to ask about her day and truly listen, not just nodding absent-mindedly. There was a new depth to their connection that felt as though it had been missing for years. Rebecca thought about how they had both changed since they began this journey. She had learned how to express herself more clearly, how to ask for what she needed without feeling guilty or ashamed. David, though still more reserved, had begun to share his own vulnerabilities, his own fears. He was no longer hiding behind the mask of being the strong, silent type. He was becoming more open, more present. It hadn't always been easy. There were times when they had disagreed, moments when the old habits crept back in, when the fear of rejection or judgment made them retreat into their shells. But they had learned to fight for each other, to meet in the middle when they disagreed, to compromise when necessary. They had learned that love wasn't just about keeping the peace, it was about learning, growing, and accepting each other's flaws along the way. Rebecca's thoughts were interrupted when she heard the back door creak open, and David stepped out onto the porch, a gentle smile on his face. "Hey," he said softly, taking a seat beside her. "I thought you'd be inside by now." "I was just thinking," Rebecca replied, closing her book and turning to face him, "about how much has changed in the past few months." David nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "Yeah, me too. I've been thinking a lot about us. About how we've been working through this, even when it wasn't easy." Rebecca smiled, her heart swelling at his words. "I never realized how much we had been avoiding until we started being honest with each other. It's like, we've been living in this quiet disconnect for so long, and now it feels like we're finally talking again. Really talking." David leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the sky. "I think I've been afraid of what would happen if I let myself be vulnerable. It felt safer to just avoid talking about the hard stuff, you know? But now, it feels like a weight's been lifted." Rebecca reached over and took his hand, feeling a sense of contentment wash over her. "I know exactly what you mean. It feels like we're not just in this together, but that we're really with each other. Not just physically, but emotionally too." For a moment, they sat in silence, their fingers intertwined. The evening sky stretched out before them, the fading light a reminder of how far they had come. It wasn't just about the therapy sessions, the talks they had had, or the small gestures they had made to show love. It was the quiet, unspoken connection that had begun to rebuild itself over time. It was the way they could now sit together, in peace, without the need to fill every space with words. Rebecca felt a sudden surge of gratitude. She had spent so many years thinking about what was missing in her marriage, what was wrong, that she had forgotten to appreciate what was still there, the love, the commitment, the history they had built together. She had been so focused on what they had lost that she hadn't taken the time to recognize all that they still had. David turned to her then, his voice soft and sincere. "I know we still have a lot of work ahead of us, but I'm not afraid anymore. I think we can make it, Rebecca. I think we can find our way back to each other, and even make it stronger than before." Rebecca's heart swelled as she looked at him, seeing him truly for the first time in a long while, not just as her husband, but as the person she had fallen in love with so many years ago. It wasn't just the physical attraction that had always drawn her to him, it was the way he made her feel, seen, valued, and loved. And now, as she looked at him, she realized how much she had missed that feeling. "I want that too, David," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to keep growing with you, to keep finding new ways to love each other." David smiled and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his eyes full of warmth. "I'm glad. Because I think we're only just beginning." The next few weeks brought more moments of closeness and understanding. The love that Rebecca had once thought lost was slowly being rediscovered, not in grand gestures, but in small, quiet acts of care. Their conversations became deeper, their intimacy more genuine. They learned to talk about things they had been avoiding for years, things that once felt too painful or too awkward to address. But now, it felt natural. Necessary. One evening, they found themselves sitting together in the living room, the soft hum of the TV in the background. Rebecca turned to David, a playful smile on her face. I was thinking, she began, about how we used to go out all the time, just the two of us. Remember when we'd get dressed up for a night out? We need to do that again. David raised an eyebrow, looking intrigued. You want to go out? Just the two of us? Yes, she replied with a laugh. I miss it. I miss us. We've gotten so used to staying in, which I love, but we used to have fun going out together. We should plan something, just for us. David's expression softened, and he nodded. I'd like that. It was a small decision, but it felt significant. It was a sign that they were no longer just trying to fix what had been broken, they were actively trying to make new memories together. They were rediscovering each other, step by step. As the months passed, Rebecca and David continued their journey of healing. They were by no means perfect, and their relationship was still a work in progress, but they had learned the most important lesson of all: love wasn't something that just happened. It was something you worked for, every day. It was in the quiet moments, the shared laughter, the vulnerability, and the willingness to grow together. And that, Rebecca realized, was all she really needed to make their love stronger than it had ever been before. As the months passed, Rebecca and David found themselves in a rhythm they hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments when the old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But for the most part, they were more connected than they had been in years, emotionally, physically, and even spiritually. They had made significant progress, but life, as it always does, had a way of throwing new challenges their way. It was a Sunday afternoon when the weight of the world seemed to land on their shoulders. Rebecca had been looking forward to a quiet weekend. The kids were out with friends, and David had taken the day off. They had planned to spend the afternoon together, perhaps finishing some small projects around the house, or just enjoying a quiet day of connection. But as the afternoon wore on, the phone calls and messages started to flood in. David had been working for a major tech firm for over a decade, and recently, there had been rumors of budget cuts and downsizing. He hadn't said much about it, but Rebecca could sense that the tension in his shoulders was more than just the usual stress. And now, it seemed that the worst had come to pass. David had received a call while they were eating lunch. He excused himself to take it, and Rebecca could hear snippets of the conversation through the open kitchen door. Her heart sank as she overheard the words company-wide layoffs, and we'll need to discuss your role in the coming weeks. When David finally returned to the table, he looked pale, his face drawn with concern. I'm sorry, he said, his voice tight. They've decided to lay off a number of people. I don't know if my job's safe yet, but it doesn't look good. Rebecca felt a lump form in her throat. She had known something was coming, but hearing it out loud was different. This was a serious blow, one that could change everything. She knew the weight of it, both for David and for their family. The uncertainty hung in the air like a thick fog, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the familiar ache of fear creep into her chest. David sat down heavily at the table, his hand rubbing his temples. I don't know what I'm going to do if I lose my job. I've been with this company for so long. It feels like everything I've worked for is slipping away. Rebecca reached out, placing her hand over his, grounding him with her touch. She knew this wasn't just about the job, it was about his identity, his sense of purpose. David, we'll get through this. I know it's scary, and I know it feels like everything's changing. But we've been through difficult times before. We can face this together. David looked at her, his eyes full of a mix of gratitude and despair. I don't know if I can do this again, Rebecca. I feel like I've failed. Rebecca shook her head gently. You haven't failed, David. Losing a job doesn't mean you've failed. It's just a bump in the road, and we will find a way through it. You're not alone in this. We'll get through this as a team, like we always do. David nodded, but the doubt lingered in his eyes. It was clear that the weight of the situation was pulling at him. Rebecca could see the exhaustion on his face, the burden of his worries. He had always prided himself on being the provider, the steady rock of the family, and now that stability seemed to be slipping through his fingers. As the evening progressed, they talked more about the situation, about the uncertainty, about the possibility of David having to search for a new job, and about the changes that might come to their daily lives. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And as they talked, Rebecca could feel a sense of closeness between them that hadn't been there before. It was as if, through the vulnerability and fear, they were reaching a new level of trust. The following days were filled with tension and uncertainty. David spent hours on the phone, updating his resume, reaching out to contacts, and exploring potential job opportunities. Rebecca tried to maintain a sense of normalcy at home, focusing on her work and keeping things as stable as possible for the kids. But there was no denying that the atmosphere had shifted. The unease was palpable, and Rebecca could feel it in her bones. The future felt uncertain, and with it came a new challenge for their marriage. But in the midst of the uncertainty, something remarkable began to happen. They both started to lean into the discomfort rather than retreat from it. The emotional walls they had once built, the ones that kept them from being fully vulnerable with each other, started to fall away. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, they found themselves sitting together on the couch, the weight of the day settling in. David was quiet, his eyes tired, and Rebecca felt a deep ache in her heart for him. She knew how much he hated feeling powerless, how much he prided himself on being able to provide for their family. "You don't have to be the one to fix everything," Rebecca said softly, reaching for his hand. "I know you feel like it's all on your shoulders, but it's not. You don't have to carry all of this alone." David's eyes softened as he looked at her. I don't want to let you down." Rebecca smiled gently, squeezing his hand. "You're not letting me down. We're in this together, remember? Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. We've always made it through the tough times before. This won't be any different." David let out a long sigh, and for a moment, Rebecca could see the weight lift slightly from his shoulders. It wasn't a solution to their problems, but it was a moment of understanding, a moment of connection that reassured them both. "I've been so focused on what I can't control," David said, his voice low. "I haven't been thinking about the things I can. I haven't been thinking about you, or us, or what we have." Rebecca reached out and gently cupped his face, looking him in the eye. "You're right. And that's okay. We've both been focused on the future, on what we might lose. But we have each other. We have our family. And no matter what happens, that's what matters most." David smiled, the tension easing in his face. "I think you're right," he said, his voice full of quiet appreciation. "I just needed to hear it." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the situation still heavy but now shared between them, no longer something David had to bear alone. It wasn't the end of their struggles, but it was a new beginning, one where they could face the unknown together. As the days turned into weeks, David found a renewed sense of purpose. He threw himself into the job search with a new focus, but this time, he wasn't doing it alone. Rebecca was by his side, every step of the way, supporting him, encouraging him, and reminding him that their love was not contingent on his job or his success. When David finally received a job offer, one that was even better than his previous position, it felt like a victory not just for him, but for both of them. They had weathered the storm together, and the experience had deepened their connection in ways they hadn't expected. It wasn't just about finding a new job, it was about discovering a new strength in each other, a resilience that had been tested but never broken. Rebecca and David sat together that evening, celebrating the good news, but more than that, they celebrated the journey they had been on together. It had been a difficult chapter, one full of uncertainty, fear, and doubt, but it had also been one of growth. Together, they had faced the hardest challenges of their marriage, and they had come out stronger for it. "Whatever comes next," David said, looking at Rebecca with deep affection, "I know we'll face it together. I'm not afraid anymore." Rebecca smiled, feeling her heart swell with love. "Me neither. Whatever happens, we're in this for the long haul." And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet comfort of each other's presence, they both knew that they had truly found something worth fighting for. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm golden glow across the living room. It was a quiet Sunday, but Rebecca and David both felt the weight of something important. Something had shifted over the last few months, something deep and meaningful. They had faced their fears, their vulnerabilities, and their uncertainties, and they had come out on the other side stronger, more connected, and more certain of their commitment to each other. The house was still and calm, the kids still asleep, and for the first time in a long while, Rebecca felt a sense of peace wash over her. Life had not returned to perfect, there were still challenges to come, more hurdles to face, but they were no longer the same people they had been when this journey started. They had changed. They had transformed, both as individuals and as a couple. Rebecca and David had been through a lot. The layoffs, the emotional strain, the doubts that had crept into their minds, they had weathered it all together. And now, sitting in the quiet of their home, Rebecca realized that this was the moment when they could truly start anew. It wasn't just about moving forward, it was about embracing the future with open arms, knowing that they could face whatever came next, as long as they were together. David came into the living room, a coffee cup in hand, his face relaxed, and his eyes filled with quiet confidence. He had changed too. The man who had once been so burdened by his role as the provider, the one who carried the weight of everything on his shoulders, now seemed lighter, more present. And it wasn't just the job offer, though that had been a huge relief. It was the way they had come to understand each other, the way they had built a foundation of trust, communication, and emotional intimacy that had been missing for so long. David sat down beside Rebecca on the couch, his hand reaching for hers. He didn't need to say anything, his presence alone was enough to remind her of the strength of their connection. They had made it through so much, and now together, they could face whatever came next. "How do you feel?" David asked softly, his voice filled with warmth and care. Rebecca smiled, her eyes meeting his with a depth of emotion she hadn't felt in years. "I feel hopeful. I feel like we've really turned a corner, like we're starting something new. I feel like we've been through so much together, and now we're ready to move forward, not just as a family, but as a couple." David nodded, squeezing her hand. "I feel that too. It's like we've grown in ways I didn't even know we needed to. And I'm proud of us. We've fought for this, for each other. And now, we get to enjoy the rewards of that hard work." Rebecca leaned her head on his shoulder, savoring the comfort of his touch, the familiarity of his presence. She knew their marriage wasn't perfect, and it never would be. They still had their moments of tension, their disagreements, and their individual struggles. But what had changed was their ability to face it all together, as a team. A few weeks later, Rebecca and David stood together at the edge of their backyard, the cool evening air surrounding them as they watched the sunset. The kids were playing inside, and for once, they had the time to just be. To be with each other. To be present in the moment. David wrapped his arm around Rebecca's waist, pulling her close. "Remember when we used to come out here and talk about our dreams?" he said softly, his voice filled with nostalgia. Rebecca smiled, remembering the days when their conversations had been full of hope and promise. When they had both been so eager to build a future together, before the distractions of life and the demands of family and work had clouded their connection. "Yes," she replied, her voice gentle. "I remember." David turned to her, his expression more serious now. "I think we've started to dream again, Rebecca. We've started to think about the future. About what we want, and what we're capable of. And I don't want to stop dreaming with you." Rebecca's heart swelled as she looked up at him. She had always known that the foundation of their love was built on shared dreams, on mutual respect, and on a commitment to build something meaningful together. But in recent years, those dreams had been buried beneath the weight of daily life. Now, they were coming back to life. "I don't want to stop dreaming with you either," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We've been through so much, but I know that we're just getting started. There's so much more for us to discover together." David smiled, pulling her closer, his arms wrapping around her tightly. "Together," he repeated softly. "Always." As the weeks turned into months, Rebecca and David found themselves moving forward with a renewed sense of purpose. They made time for each other, time to talk, to laugh, to dream, and to simply be. They scheduled date nights, they traveled when they could, and they carved out moments of connection amidst the busyness of life. They didn't take each other for granted anymore. They knew how precious their love was, and they were determined to nurture it. David had started his new job, one that challenged him in new ways but also gave him a sense of fulfillment he hadn't realized he had been missing. And Rebecca, too, had begun to rediscover passions she had put on hold for years, whether it was working on creative projects, pursuing new hobbies, or just taking the time to care for herself. They had both grown individually, and in doing so, they had grown closer as a couple. They had learned that love wasn't just about what they did for each other, it was about showing up, being vulnerable, and allowing each other the space to grow. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Rebecca and David found themselves sitting on the porch again, just like they had on so many evenings before. But this time, it was different. This time, it felt like the beginning of something new. David turned to Rebecca, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "So, what do you think? Are we ready for the next chapter?" Rebecca looked at him, her heart full. "I think we've already started it," she said softly. "And I think it's going to be the best chapter yet." David squeezed her hand, his eyes full of affection. "Me too." And as they sat there together, watching the night sky unfold before them, Rebecca realized that this was what they had been searching for all along, not perfection, but the kind of love that was real. A love that had been tested, yes, but had also been strengthened by every challenge they had faced. A love that was built on trust, communication, and a shared commitment to always show up for each other, no matter what. Together, they were ready for whatever the future would bring. And for the first time in a long time, Rebecca knew deep in her heart that, no matter what, they would face it as a team.